My name is Doug Duda. I'm moderating this particular panel proudly, and would like to begin by introducing our panelists. First, Sasha Gora is a writer and cultural historian with a focus on food history and contemporary art, often separately, but sometimes together. Since April 2015, she's a doctoral candidate at the Rachel Carlson Center for Environment and Society, where she's researching the new Nordic food movement, contemporary Canadian cuisine, and reimaginations of First Nations food cultures. A Torontonian by birth and at heart, she studied in Montreal, Copenhagen, Gothenburg, and now lives in Munich. More about her at lsashagora.com. And she'll be going first, followed by Gilian Riley, English food writer with a passion for the history of Italian gastronomy, which has become her life's work, and she is involved in many ways with telling the story and showing the story of food and art, including the series Painters and Food for Pomegranate Books, Renaissance Recipes, Impressionist Picnics, and the Dutch Table, as well as Food in Art by Reaction Books in 2015, which covers earliest times to the Renaissance. And she is also the author of the Oxford Companion to Italian Food, which describes contemporary Italian food in its historic background. And she's currently working on a biography of Ulisse Aldrovandi, close, the 16th century naturalist. Very happy to have them both, and would like to turn things over now to Sasha.
Thank you very much, Doug, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's my first time here at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, and I'm very excited. I'm also very happy that yesterday I had the chance to eat some foods that I've never eaten before, which I think is important because I am presenting on something that I also haven't eaten. So it makes up for it somewhat. And I'm also really excited to be going after Paul because I think he brought up so many interesting examples, and with his chart in terms of which animals are imagined as edible and which ones North Americans eat. Beaver was not on it, but if it was on it, it would also be at the very end. So my talk today is called From Meat to Mascot, the Presence and Absence of Beaver in Canadian Cuisine. And so my background is in art history, and now that I'm working more and more with food cultural history, I find that things haven't changed too much in terms of my approach and my methods, but the big difference is instead of asking if something is art and what it does as art, now I always ask, is it food? Is it edible? Do people eat it? Why? Why not? And so that was very much the starting point for my research about beaver. So beaver is by far the most important animal in Canada, historically speaking, but also in terms of the contemporary imagination. And so since 1975, it's an official emblem of the country, and you'll see it all over. You'll see it in logos for fashion brands, on coins, in beer commercials, but you will not see it on a menu. And so because of that, I was quite interested in thinking about it in terms of offal, so in terms of a rejected food, and foods that are edible, but they're not eaten or not considered food. So the structure of my talk today is in 3 parts, and it's based on how one would go about eating beaver in Canada. So Canada has very strict regulations about wild meat, which is important because of the history, and it's regulated differently in each province and in each territory. However, in almost all of Canada, it's illegal to sell wild game in restaurants or in grocery stores. And so because of that, if somebody wants to eat beaver, one would have to trap the beaver themselves. And so the 3 parts of my talk today, the first one is spotting beaver, so actually finding beaver and looking at what kind of beaver are we even looking for. And then the second part is about trapping the beaver, And then the third part is about cooking the beaver. So with beaver spotting, I started my paper with a reference to this image of a very, very cute beaver, which is the beginning of a video at the Minnesota History Center. And it's a video about the history of the fur trade and European settlement. And as a Canadian, when I saw this, I saw all for a hat, and I thought this could also be called Canadian history in a nutshell. And it's also a nice illustration of what Glenys Hood writes in her 2011 book about beavers, The Beaver Manifesto, where she describes beaver as, quote, a furry rodent with an overbite and a history the size of a country. So here the beaver is looking very, very cute with the overbite and the big tail. However, Rachel Poliquin, who wrote a book about beavers in 2015, begins her book by pointing out that although beavers leave very obvious visual traces, so in terms of dams, lodges, a tree that a beaver has chewed, they're actually difficult to spot themselves. You're much more likely to see a trace of a beaver than you are to see the actual beaver. And so this is an artwork by David Divany, which is from 2009, and it's called Lodge. And it was installed in a reflecting pool at a bus station in Kitchener, Ontario. And so you see the logs here that are rather uniform in size, and it looks very lifelike to the point that you can almost imagine a beaver swimming out from underneath it. However, the logs are not actually logs at all. They're not made from wood. They're made from PVC pipe with construction adhesive to resemble wood. And so it's kind of a take on this transition between the natural and the built environment. So something that looks organic but is actually synthetic, something that looks like wood but is actually PVC. So in terms of what beaver we would kind of expect possibly to swim out from underneath, there are two distinct species of beavers. And they look identical, which makes it difficult to tell them apart. So there's the Eurasian beaver, the castor fiber, which once lived from Britain to Russia to Mongolia. And then in North America, there's the castor canadensis. And so it was actually only in the 1970s that they were identified as two different species through chromosome analysis. However, even in captivity, they do not interbreed. So they're really two separate species. So beavers transform landscapes, they influence ecosystems, and create habitats for plants and other animals, hence their nickname of ecosystem engineers. So this is what we're looking for. And now it's the question of beaver trapping, how we would go about doing that. And as Paul also talked about, many food taboos are about meat. Meat is very much a signifier of difference. And hunting also connects to social hierarchies, and depending on the period and the context, it can either be seen as an indicator of poverty or of wealth and nobility. And I also think that specific cultural practices of hunting can influence perspectives on animals and what counts as edible. So really thinking about differences in traditions of hunting for sport or for hunting for food. So leaving beavers shortly, this is a 2015 installation by the Toronto-based artist Kent Monkman of Cree ancestry, and it's called The Rise and Fall of Civilization, and it was installed at the Gardner Museum in Toronto, which is a museum for ceramics. And so it narrates a story that is similar to that of the fur trade and of beavers, but it is here about bison. So the installation consists of the buffalo jump in the middle, which is a cliff formation that Native Americans use for hunting mass quantities of bison, a sculpture of the artist's very interesting alter ego, Mischief Eagle Testicle, two full-size bison, and a pile of smashed ceramics that represent bone. And so what it's referring to is essentially the waste that was created in terms of the demand for bison, and so them being killed for their pelts and the meat being left to rot. So in terms of how beavers were trapped, at the beginning of the fur trade in the Americas, Aboriginal techniques were used. And so this was the norm up until the late 18th century. And so traditional methods include breaking open dams, then netting or spawning the fleeing beavers, Sometimes the entrance to a lodge would be stacked so the animals couldn't escape. And sometimes, kind of taking advantage of how clever they are, dams would be broken so the beavers would have to leave them in order to try to repair the dam. And so then in the late 17th century, steel traps began to replace these traditional methods, and they were baited with different scents to attract the beavers. So one example is red asp, a species of willow, and then they were baited with castoreum, and that was when they were very, very efficient in killing many, many beavers, to the point that the species in the Americas was endangered. However, luckily the fashion changed from felt to silk hats, and so beavers were not made extinct. So this is another artwork by Kent Monkman. This is one that addresses beavers, and it's called The King's Beavers from 2011, and so it's much more contemporary than the style of the painting suggests. And so the title does not tell us which king it is, but it's most likely King Henry IV of France, who encouraged the fur trade, nor does it really prepare us for the massacre it depicts, one in which Europeans, natives, and Catholic priests are all complicit. So this painting really depicts colonialism in the Americas as a battle over beavers, one with both economic and symbolic stakes, but it's also an ironic story in the sense that killing beavers generated wealth and power, while also risking replenishing a steady supply of beavers on which that wealth and power was based. So surely during the fur trade, we can conceptualize beaver meat as a kind of offal, in the sense that the meat of the animal was left to rot, similar to what we saw in Monkman's installation. Not all of it, but it wasn't considered as valuable as the pelt, as the fur itself. So regarding hunting regulations today, I'm just going to give an example from the province of Ontario. So there's two different types of licenses. There's a hunting license and a trapping license. And so essentially anyone who is hunting or trapping in the province, other than someone who is a resident hunter apprentice or a member of our Aboriginal community, requires one of these licenses. However, it's important to note that regarding Aboriginal treaties, if you're a member of a community, you can only hunt in the specific area that the treaty addresses. So if you want to hunt in a different part of the province, you would too require a license. And so in order to get a trapping license, one must complete the fur harvest, fur management, and conservation course, which is a 40-hour class, 32 hours in the classroom, and 8 hours of hands-on pelt preparation and trap setting. So the regulations for this license very much assumes that one is interested first and foremost in the pelt of the animal. However, the regulations do specify that the meat from beaver can also be eaten. And the season for trapping beaver is generally from October to the end of April or May. Which brings us to beaver as food, so cooking and eating beaver. So if you're looking for beaver in Canada, you're most likely to encounter this, beaver tails. So nothing to really do with the beaver itself. It's not the tail of a beaver, but a pastry that is whole wheat yeasted dough that is stretched flat, fried in hot oil, and topped with melted butter and sweet confections like cinnamon and sugar. And so this is a really kind of classic staple that was given a very Canadian name in 1978 by Grant and Pam Hooker when they opened their first beaver tail stall. And I think this is also interesting because beaver tails are now available in other countries. So for example, they have a location in Seoul, in the United Arab Emirates, in the United States. And so it's also very much marketing this Canadian beaver product to tourists, to Canadians, and to people in other countries. And I think that in order to call this a beaver tail really requires distance. Only when the beaver is unimaginable as edible does the name really work. I don't think it would be as popular if you called it, pig trotters or chicken liver. It's a little bit too close to what one would imagine. So then with the question of who actually eats beaver flesh, there are some native cookbooks, such as Gathering What the Great Nature Provides, and Native Indian Cookbook, Wild Game, Fish, and Wild Edible, that reveal the beaver as edible. However, this is not a belief that is reserved to only one side of the Atlantic. And I think this is what's really interesting, because when I've started asking people if they've ever had beaver, if they knew it was edible, sometimes in Canada the perception is that it's a native food, it's a country food. However, the Catholic Church actually classified beaver as primarily aquatic, and so fish. And so beaver was a popular meat to eat on Fridays and during Lent. And this actually, before the fur trade, before there was a demand for the pelts of beaver, beavers were hunted for castoreum and for meat. So I think this is really interesting in terms of the historical narrative of why they were hunted, and the fact that little of this culinary history seems to live on, at least in Canada today. However, it is not traditional in all Aboriginal nations to eat beaver. So for example, in western parts of what is now Canada, in the Great Plains, because of the limited availability of water, the beavers were often sacred, and so there were a lot of bison, and so there was no need to eat beavers. Beavers were more important in terms of building ponds and dams than as a meat source. So turning to recipes now, perhaps because of its rodent status, beaver never seems to have been the most popular of meats in the Americas. However, there are lots of recipes for beavers, especially if one looks online, especially on sites focusing on hunting, for things such as beaver with barbecue sauce and beaver tenderloin roast. So in John Russell's Book of Nature from around 1460, in a section called Carving a Fish, he recommends serving beaver tail as the meat in pea soup. In a 1967 cookbook published by the Canadian Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, there is a recipe for sweet pickled beaver. It calls for cloves, brown sugar, vinegar, dry white wine or apple juice, pineapple juice, dry mustard, the juice and rind of a lemon, and mixed pickling spices and cinnamon. One example of a recipe for beaver in a contemporary Canadian cookbook is from Chef Martin Picard's 2012 Sugar Shack au pied de cochon, and the dish is called Confederation Beaver. There's 6 pages of instructions and over 30 step-by-step photos. And its rather controversial name and intricate steps suggest that such a recipe is anything but everyday fare. So to prepare the beaver, it's stripped of its sacks, stuffed with its own tail, and steeped in hot water. And the ingredients include oyster and button mushrooms, pig's blood, cream, foie gras, and maple smoked ham. So Martin Picard is also responsible for giving Anthony Bourdain his first taste of beaver on a 2013 episode of Parts Unknown. But here he cooked it in a much more basic stew. And Bourdain's verdict was that it was absolutely delicious. And because, as I said, I wouldn't find it on a menu in Canada, and the closest I've gotten to hunting or trapping a beaver is chasing a raccoon with a broom from my garbage can in Toronto, I have to rely on the taste buds and descriptions of others to sketch out an idea of how beaver might taste. So Marius Barbeau, the anthropologist, said that its flavor and appearance resemble those of the choicest bacon. The French naturalist Pierre Ballon described it as tasting like nicely dressed eel. Niels Giesler describes it as tasting like pork. In an article in the Globe and Mail from 2014, it's described as tasting like fatty lamb. And the article also quotes Martin Picard as saying that I can say beaver tastes a bit like chicken, but it is unique. And then last week I was talking with David McMillan from the Montreal restaurant Joe Beef about regulations regarding serving wild game in restaurants in Quebec. And I asked him what he thought of beaver, and he said that it sucks. It's not good. And when I asked him to describe how it would taste, he paused and he said once again, beaver sucks, like dirty duck, swampy, trouty duck. But then Martin said it tastes like scallops. So in terms of descriptions, we have bacon, eel, pork, fatty lamb, chicken, dirty duck, and scallops. So the descriptions of the flavor of beaver really covered the sea, land, and sky. And then last year, as part of Cook It Raw in Alberta, a chef from Edmonton, Braden Kuzak, who works at Three Boars, decided to cook beaver. And he said in the video, quote, "Beaver meat is obviously something extremely underutilized in cooking in Canada. Growing up, you learn a lot about the fur trade and how important beaver was to the pioneers. So it kind of made sense to bring something that was so important to our nation's history," end quote. Or perhaps is that importance what makes it seem inedible? Is it because the beaver has so much symbolic, historic value that it's not seen as meat at all? Which brings us to the tail end of the presentation. So a lot more research is required. I still have a lot of questions about why did the beaver not emerge as real food? Or was it once more popular for settlers to eat, only for them to then reject it in favor of domesticated animals? For whom was it food and for whom was it not? Is it difficult to imagine beaver today in contemporary Canada as food because of its status as a national emblem? Is it the nature of emblems to not be eaten? So nonetheless, by beginning to ask why in Canada the beaver is more often imagined as a mascot and less as meat, and therefore as rejected meat, it provides an interesting example of the hierarchies and histories of eating animals.
Are you sitting comfortably? Now we've got the blinds down, you will probably sleep like babies. And we're all getting terribly hungry. So I hope this will improve your appetites. The first image is one I came across years ago when I was doing a book about the history of food in the Netherlands with recipes. And I was intrigued by this amazing portrait of a woman in a kitchen. Other paintings by the same artist are really rather banal, of rather boring people in boring kitchens doing everyday things. But this young woman is strangely sinister. The whole painting is so numinous. She's not even dressed like a kitchen maid. Her hair is flowing loose. Her garments are sort of vaguely like a priestess. And this deep red curtain in the background picks up the color of the meat in the tub. What she is doing is chopping offal, pluck, a mixture of lungs and liver and lights and kidneys and heart and whatever you care to put in. She has a bloody great cleaver in her right hand, and you can see that when she starts chopping, the fur will literally fly. She's going to get splattered. It's a horrendous concept. That's probably why she seized upon a passing tablecloth and wrapped it round her head and shoulders to catch some of the blood. But the whole impact of this picture is now different for us since yesterday's keynote speech, when we were warned that what we're going to have to do is think about the components of our food, how they're produced, how we prepare them, how we eat them, and offal is tremendously important in this context. And here we have it in the 17th century Netherlands, where it is presumably going, once chopped, will be either stewed, or it will be a fry-up, or will be made into brawn, or put into sausages, or cooked with the root vegetables that you can see in the foreground. So we have not only an enigmatic portrait, but a very potent message for today. It reminds me of when I was researching for a little essay I wrote recently about offal in Hackney, in London, where I live. I went down Ridley Road Market, and there was a living, walking examples of this new message about including offal in our diet. It was all happening under our very noses. there are at least 5 or 6 butchers in Ridley Road selling every imaginable kind of offal to our various ethnic minorities. We have heads, tails, trotters, feet of various kinds, and all kinds of tripe and organs I didn't even know existed, and great frozen blocks of pluck, exactly the same colours as what you see in the painting, which have been frozen, and then as they defrost you can get the butcher to hack off however much you want for a tasty stew. So it's all there under our noses. All we have to do is assimilate. Now, the next painting again shows more pluck, used by another Dutch painter in the 1660s, Van Baren, exploiting the decorative qualities of pluck. It's a wonderful sight, the way it echoes the orange of the jug and the bitter orange in the foreground, which has been chopped into bits to squeeze on the oysters. So pluck, again, is part of a decorative kitchen scene and a civilized meal. We see it again here in the Tacuinum Sanitatis. This was a medieval Arab health handbook, which was translated into Latin and produced as, I think, what must have been the first ever coffee table book in 1380, when no one had ever heard of coffee. From then on, we just had to either invent it or explore for it. But the format of the book seriously was coffee table, because the text was cut down to a minimum, but the message, which is about quite a serious one, about the health properties of the food we eat and the things we do which affect our health. Every single one was illustrated with a charming picture like this. And what's useful to us as historians is that these are everyday people going about everyday tasks. And you can see the woman is buying, I don't know, kidneys or liver, and he's cutting pluck from the hanging carcass. Here is another completely different kind of butcher's shop. It was painted in the 1550s, quite early on, in Antwerp by Peter Aertsen. And wiser heads than mine, and there are a lot of them about, have done tremendous research into this painting. And the background is all to do with local politics, the local guild of butchers, real estate shenanigans, all kinds of things going on that I'm not really qualified to expound. But for us, there is an immense amount of material about the meat which was hung up and sold in markets at that time. And you can see that amongst the prime cuts of meat for stewing and roasting, we have a pig's head in the middle, we've got pluck, we've got lungs and fat, we've got about 5 different kinds of sausages, we have the flayed head of an ox, and we have some trotters. The fact that the trotters are crossed over each other in the shape of a cross, as are both the 2 different kinds of preserved fish. Do you want something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask what the red powder was under the calf's head.
I think it's blood pudding. It's 2 different kinds of, the dark stuff is blood pudding in a very fine pastry case, and the other is probably some kind of cheesy custard tart. So we go now to a very different kind of butcher. This is Annibale Carracci, about 30 years later in Bologna. And here we don't get to see an awful lot of offal if you discount the bulging codpiece of the military man on the left. We have at least got a cascade of offal coming out of the animal on the right. The interesting thing about this, it also has a complicated social history, which again I haven't been into but other people have. And what strikes one here is not just the realism of the meat, but the realism of these portraits of men with a profession, with professional skills, going about their daily work with dignity. This is giving butchers respect. Unlike Pazzarotti, who was a contemporary of Carracci, and here we have the cheeky chappy butcher's boys, ciao bella, how's your uncle? And the I think rather repulsive to us, sneering at the rather low habits of working class people. There's no dignity here, but there is quite a lot of meat to look at. And because of the vibrancy of these rather unpleasant characters, you forget that in the bottom left-hand corner, he's jokingly putting his hand into the mouth of the head of a wild boar, and you can see its trotter in the middle. So again, heads and feet keep reappearing in images of offal. Here we are again, back with the tacuinum sanitatis, with various kinds of meat hanging up, and the poor old ox being butchered before us. Another picture from the tacuinum is the slaughtering of pigs. And you can see how in the foreground the poor creature's throat is being cut for the blood to make the blood puddings. Another detail from another painting by Carracci, a much smaller one than the one we've just looked at. And here again, there are people going about their work with dignity, and you can see much more. There's a sort of festoon of offal on the right emerging from the carcass. And here's a bit of a detail of it. And then this gives you just some idea, it's a detail from the other painting, of the rapidity with which he was painting and the exploitation of the beauty of these animal parts. And this was long before Impressionism, obviously, when we might have come to expect it. And some art historians have assumed that Carracci was unusually, for the time, actually set up his canvas near the meat market stall and was painting all this from life. Another little vignette from the tacuinum, this time it's tripe. Here the women are doing all the work, and terrible work it is, starting off with cow's or a sheep's stomach and cleaning it from scratch is horrendous, because the amount of material being digested in this series of stomachs, as the digestion proceeds, the bacterial activity is quite pongy and horrible. And here the women are hard at work, cleaning on the left, cooking on the right, and the men, as usual, are just enjoying themselves in the background. Another painting here, this time by Josefa Obidos in Portugal, 17th century. You can see how the animal parts, the live hen on the right who is about to be slaughtered, the head of the ram on the left, and the pluck above him on the left are being exploited for their decorative qualities. It's a charming painting. You'd love to have this on your wall. It's so beautiful. And here again, Barrera, a Spanish still life painter of the period. This is illustrating the month of April, and you've got pluck up on the left, you've got a carcass in the foreground, and in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got the only images I've been able to find of either sweetbreads or testicles. Again, a testimony that they were posh food, not food to be despised or sold cheaply to the poor. We have the head of a recently killed sheep looking fairly miserable about it. And worse still, on the right, we have a young lamb waiting to be slaughtered. The Agnus Dei of Obidos, again, reminds us that we were slaughtering young animals to eat. It's happening here too in Italian spills. No, this is still Spanish, still live painting. You've got a dead animal on the left curving upwards, and on the right, the horrific sight of a sheep or an ox's head, which has been flayed and then chopped in two down the middle with a cleaver. You know, when cooking heads, you have to do this in order to remove the brain and the tongue and any other bits and pieces you might want to cook separately before you boil the head up to make brawn or head cheese or whatever. Here again is an ox's head, used, it's a detail from the Aertsen we've just looked at, used for decorative purposes, again along with trotters, and it is so beautiful, this painting. You admire the beauty of the colours and the composition and all the interesting information for us, but you forget the horrors behind it. Goya reminds us, this is 1806, he was painting about the time of the Peninsular Wars when Spaniards were being slaughtered by various invading armies. And here is a slaughtered animal. You can see the pain and the misery of this creature which we have killed in order to eat. Here again, this is a complete contrast. It's totally banal. It's pig killing day in the Low Countries. We've killed the pig and it's hanging there rather like curtains would. It's strung with string onto a ladder, but it's been washed clean of blood and gore. It's been eviscerated, leaving only the kidneys. It's been singed and covered with, squirted with boiling water in order to scrape off the skin. Not the skin, the bristles. The head has been removed and it's sitting in one of those tubs waiting to be dealt with. And the little boy on the left has the bladder and he's blowing down a straw into the bladder to make a football. And you notice how it's part of an immaculate Dutch interior. There's not a speck of blood or dust on the floor. It's all, it's not an animal anymore, it's food. Here again, a kitchen scene with all kinds of things going on, but in the basket in front of the couple, we have heads and feet. And again, a frighteningly scary head on the left of the young woman on the table, showing how these cuts were as important as what we've come to look at as the posh ones. Here we have again heads and feet and some pluck on the right of the pig's head and a blood sausage to the right of that. Totally banal, they're just ingredients. And the real beauty of the picture is in the light bouncing off the different kinds of fruit. More information here in Empoli, Jacopo Chimenti di Empoli, who painted luxurious kitchen scenes for his patrons, the Dukes of Florence. And I think it was probably Vasari or someone equally malicious, claimed that he spent a lot of his patrons' money on amassing the ingredients for the painting, the expensive fowls, the hair, and so on, hanging them all up, painting them. When the painting was done and delivered, he and his studio feasted on the props. But among them, again, you see heads and feet. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can just make out the head of an animal, and trotters in the middle, and to the right of that, a cow's head. Here we have the heads again being bought and sold in the tacoinum. You can see how the butcher has cleaved it asunder down the middle. Another head, horrifyingly displayed on the left, along with a picturesque profusion of vegetables. And very interestingly, it's the only example I've found of a joint of meat ready to be put on the spit, wrapped in caul fat to baste it as it cooks. Here again, we have another kitchen still life painting with, this is Spanish, 17th century, with one of the rare showings I've seen of chicken offal. You've got unlaid eggs and what looks like hearts and gizzards and things in the blue plate. And to the right of that, you have cured meat, sausages, and a thing which looks to me rather like a haggis, the pudding-like thing on the right, which is tied at either end. And it's the only example, visual example I've seen of one of the enormous range of puddings or haggises or sausages or whatever into which offal was put. There's another paper in the pipeline which will tell you far more about this than I can, and reinforces the point that I was coming to in looking for offal in art, was first of all that it's not humble meat which is sold cheaply to the poor. It's as respectable and delicious an ingredient as the finer cuts. And if you go through recipe books of the period, which you'll see in this paper that is to come, you find that there were innumerable puddings thickened with either grains or breadcrumbs, nuts, dried fruit, and every kind of expensive flavouring and spices. These were made with tremendous care, not as cheap fodder for drunken Scots, but as very sophisticated, complicated dishes in which offal was supreme. When you look at the Scappi's wonderful cookery book of 1570, the recipes for different kinds of offal are numerous, and they're just as sophisticated and elegant as the recipe for the prime cuts of meat. When you come to his section, you know the book, his opera, on menus, which is about an inch thick in my copy, hundreds and hundreds of different menus, the amount of offal listed in them is extraordinary. And these are feasts for popes, cardinals, kings, emperors. Scappi wasn't slumming. He wasn't cooking for clients who were somehow had to use up cheap materials. He was using offal as an important ingredient and lavishing on it the same care as he would on prime cuts. And we end with more trotters. Sally Granger will have more to tell us about offal in the ancient world, but these are just some trotters from a Roman mosaic in Tunisia. And here we have the tacoinum again, when the good ladies of the house are preparing sheep's trotters, which were eaten as a delicacy, or were they? Here they are in the final image, a painting by von Hunsdorf of a breakfast scene, which is a sophisticated snack meal, but using a fine damask tablecloth, beautiful glass, fine wines, hothouse fruit, nice bread, butter, and a ham which was prime meat in the centre, but on the left you have a plate of trotters, and above that a tongue. And this painting exists in many different versions. This one is in the Bose Museum, but it obviously was a popular topic with the painter's clients, that he painted it over and over again. So we have an example here of tongue and trotters being grouped with sophisticated snacks in a rich setting. So long live Offal, I say. And I'm hearing hungry rumbles. So we can put the lights back on and go and have our lunch at last. Thank you.